Hey, everybody. Greetings and welcome to the ABT Time podcast. And this is our probably roughly 30th episode, something along those lines. And this is going to be our third gathering of the wonderful brain trust that we have here in ABT land, known as the Unclenchables. My three colleagues from Australia will be bringing them on shortly, and I'll introduce each one when the time comes. But we've got a big topic for today, and we're only going to go for an hour, so we want to pack in a lot of stuff. And I'm going to get right into it. And our big topic for today is something that's reemerged in the media the last 2 or 3 weeks in a big way here, which is the onset and the approach of artificial intelligence and all the ominous things that come with it. And before I even start to get in there, I want to begin by trying to hopefully offer a little bit of defense of my voice, which is in the 2015 book, Houston, We Have a Narrative. I had this little section in there about this term I had heard just a year before called the Declensionist Narrative. I'd never heard that term. Everyone would do well to think about what this means. The Declensionist Narrative, inside of that word declensionist is the word decline. And what this refers to is basically people that are just worrywarts and are just positive the world's going to fall apart, the Eeyores of the world. What I wrote in the book was people need their narratives. This is something that you would do well to absorb, appreciate, and respect. Furthermore, some people seem consumed with the need for certain kinds of narratives, such as the overall story of the world falling to pieces. There's actually a term for this pessimistic outlook, declensionist narratives. This outlook is common among environmentalists to the point where some refuse to even hear good news about the world. They are only receptive to stories of decline, pretty much like Debbie Downer of Saturday Night Live. Wah, wah, wah. So I'm aware of this dynamic from the outset here. So let's hope that my colleagues don't start hurling this at me. Oh, you're just convinced that the world's going to fall apart. No, I'm aware of that element, and I'm going to be citing a lot of really prominent voices and sources in what we're going to talk about here. So we're going to discuss artificial intelligence in the context of what the ABT Time podcast is about, which is narrative structure. Talk about that in a minute. And I've got about 15 to 20 minutes worth of background and setup and quotes and things I want to run through here to set this all up, because this is such a current and important issue. Here's the basic ABT of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence has tremendous potential used in medicine, business analytics, all sorts of great things today. But it's a dual use technology capable of great good and great harm. Therefore, our discussion here. Now, 2014, Time magazine, this is the first that I started to hear of the alarms being sounded about artificial intelligence, because previous to this, I was hearing all kinds of happy, fun stories like, oh, look at what AI can do. So in 2014, Time magazine came out with a special issue entitled 5 Very Smart People Who Think Artificial Intelligence Could Bring the Apocalypse. So this is the start of me pointing to other people in terms of the concerns. It's not me being a declensionist. There were major people, starting with Stephen Hawking, the great physicist, who just in his final year of life before he died a few years ago, he was still kind of devoting all of his media attention to getting people to try and talk about artificial intelligence and what's coming for us. There were several other major people, Bill Gates and Elon Musk. They all began talking about the serious concerns. And among their 5, there was this guy, James Barrat, author of this book, Our Final Invention, that came out in 2013, the year before, which actually helped bring a lot of attention to this concern. So his book is great. And then I've listened to 2 podcasts with him, one in 2017 and then one just last year, that are really a lot of the material I'm going to share here comes from. And the interview last year, the host had asked him, what's the book about? He said the book is about the long and short-term impacts of AI, none of which could be very good. So that's his deep assessment of AI. Here's one of the things that he points to for the concerns of how rapidly this knowledge is expanding. There's a few of these problems for the human race that are so deep and so complex that people had said either they would never be solved by humans or they would take decades for something to solve. One of which is protein folding. So ever since they figured out the proteins are made up of amino acids, the important thing to know about proteins is their 3-dimensional structure, how these amino acids string together and then in 2 dimensions and then come together into 3-dimensional shape. And the processes involved in that are so complex that people had basically said humans would never be able to predict this, that maybe someday artificial intelligence would be able to predict it. But that's already happened. AI has already figured out how to predict the shape of proteins based from amino acids, despite everybody thinking it wouldn't be solved for a long time. Another one of these things that happened that stunned people was, I think 4 or 5 years ago, the Japanese game Go, which is this age-old game. It's very complex. And even though computers beat chess a decade ago, people thought the game Go would not be solved for a few more decades. Same thing happened there. An AI beat Go. And not only did it beat the game Go, the very best Go player in the world, but the way in which it beat it was in a pathway that no veteran Go players had ever seen before. It consists of several concentric rings. All of a sudden, this AI was going back out to these outer rings that normally aren't even used after the game gets going. And all the experts are looking at it like this thing it's been poorly programmed or something. And then all of a sudden it wins. Like, oh my God, humans could not be that creative. By 2030, this is what in this podcast a year ago that Bharat, we should almost have him as a guest. Maybe I'll try and see if I can eventually get him as a guest at some point. But for this episode, we don't really need him. Just these quotes are enough to talk about. In the episode last year, he said by the year 2030, that's only about to be 8 years away. AI will be the largest part of the economy. Half of all jobs will be lost to AI. There will be a paucity of jobs. Here was his advice to average working people. Don't take jobs that computers can do. Don't take factory jobs. Don't take driving jobs. Don't take postal jobs. Anything involving repetition is going to be bad news. By 2029, you'll have human intelligence in a machine for $1,000. That means, for $1,000, you'll have a machine that can do anything that a human can do in terms of problem solving. By 2045, this is the big concern, is the year that we have super intelligence. And that's where the computers hit this thing called the intelligence explosion, where there's just runaway intelligence. And the smarter they get, the smarter they make themselves. And humans by that point have completely lost control. Now, one of the things that James Bharat talked about was he said, starting in the year 2000, he was bitten by the happy bug. He focused on, look at all these amazing things AI is going to do for us. It's going to be so much fun. And then 2001, he interviewed Arthur C. Clarke, the guy who wrote the science fiction novel that 2001: A Space Odyssey was based upon. And it was in that interview that Arthur C. Clarke, who's a great futurist, said to him, "We humans steer the future, not because we're the fastest or the strongest creatures, but because we're the most intelligent. When we share the planet with something more intelligent than we are, they are going to steer the future." That's what we're talking about this year, 2045. The issue is serious enough. By 2016, the Obama administration put together this report, Preparing for the Future of Artificial Intelligence. People are beginning to really get the message. So here's a relevant question, which is, who in the world are we, Rod, Jen, Jayde, and myself, plus my extra special guest here, Brian Bielmann, I'll introduce when we get everybody together. Who are we to talk about this issue? Well, actually, there's good reason for us to talk about it and reason for people to listen to what we have to say, because we've got this new model for narrative structure, the ABT, that has brought us all together in what we do. And in the next year, it's going to be spreading much more widely than it has in the past decade as I've been developing it within the science world. This is, a year ago, I produced this book, The Narrative Gym. So that was published. We've just self-published these things. Then Park Howell this spring came to me and said, "Great book, but my business people won't use it until we put it inside the context of business." So he and I co-authored back in September. We came out with the business version of The Narrative Gym. Now hard at work with Dave Gold on the politics version that we're on track. I think early December, we should have that one out. Same thing with Doug Passon, a prominent lawyer who for a decade has been teaching storytelling to lawyers. He independently came to us and has been using the ABT for 3 years and just is infatuated with it. So he and I are working in the law version of it. Patty Limerick is using it in the history world. She and I will probably eventually co-author that one. Then Nancy Knowlton's part of the course, and she talks about it, the ABT in the environmental world. So this is a model that we are propagating that does give us a little different perspective on AI and produces a potential discussion that's different from anybody else talking about it. So more background on AI. And this is a really crucial term at the center of the whole topic, which is the singularity. And there are different versions of what's meant by the singularity. The technological singularity, or simply the singularity, is a hypothetical point in time at which technological growth becomes uncontrollable and irreversible, resulting in unforeseen changes to human civilization. According to the most popular version of the singularity hypothesis called intelligence explosion, an upgradable intelligent agent will eventually enter a, quote, runaway reaction of self-improvement cycles, each new and more intelligent generation appearing more and more rapidly, causing an explosion in intelligence and resulting in a powerful superintelligence that qualitatively far surpasses all human intelligence. The AI singularity refers to an event where the AIs in our lives either become self-aware or reach an ability for continuous improvement so powerful that it will evolve beyond our control. So then in contrast, we have Steven Pinker, psychologist, I guess. And this is maybe voicing Jayde's perspective. In 2008, he said, there is not the slightest reason to believe in a coming singularity. The fact that you can visualize a future in your imagination is not evidence that it's likely or even possible. Look at domed cities, jetpack commuting, underwater cities, mile-high buildings, and nuclear power automobiles. All staples of futuristic fantasies when I was a child that have never arrived. Sheer processing power is not a pixie dust that magically solves all your problems. So there we have the other side of the argument. Now, flipping back to the concerns, here is Moore's law, which is this doubling of intelligence that's been going on since 1900. And there it is plotted out all the way to the present time. And you see it follows this exponential scale that just continues to keep going at the same pace. We are just going up at this exponential rate in the amount of intelligence that we have. Back at the starting point in the 1800s, there was the idea of the age of reason, that we had these great minds that together we could figure out everything we need to know. And there's your alpha, Thomas Paine, with the age of reason. And there's your omega, Ray Kurzweil, who's really regarded as kind of one of the most knowledgeable futurists of AI, who does he work for? Ray Kurzweil now works for Google. And there's one of your concerns. This is an article just a month ago titled, "We Need to Talk About Transhumanism." In this article, the author says, until recently, I, like most people, I suspect, believed this stuff to be pure science fiction. But then, browsing aimlessly one night in March, I stumbled upon a passing reference to a transhumanist political party that had apparently put up a candidate for election in 2015. My immediate assumption was that it was a prank, but looking at their website, they seemed pretty serious and surprisingly active. This weekend, so this is a month ago, this weekend, hundreds of people from across the globe will assemble in Madrid to discuss how to turn themselves into a new species. The occasion is Transvision, the world's biggest annual meetup of transhumanists. This is not transgender. Let's not confuse it with the current trans issue that's much more on everybody's minds in this country. And probably the most important intellectual summit you've never heard of. This year, anti-aging specialist Aubrey de Grey will explain why he thinks most people alive today have a 50-50 chance of living to be 1,000 years old. CEO of Alcor Life Extension Foundation, Max Moore, will discuss cryogenics, the process by which the newly deceased are frozen in giant stainless steel vats and preserved for resurrection down the line. And Google's Ray Kurzweil will talk about the singularity, the moment in our not too distant future, he reckons around 2045, when artificial intelligence finally outstrips the collective brain power of mankind, absorbs us into its plans. Now, the thing that cued me onto all this was 2 weeks ago, because I've been thinking about this all along. But all of a sudden, 2 weeks ago, in the Wall Street Journal, of all places and of all people, was an editorial written by Satan himself, Henry Kissinger. So for those of us in my generation who grew up knowing who Henry Kissinger was, he is the guy that unleashed untold amounts of incivility and just horror on the nations of Cambodia and Laos and North Vietnam. At the height of the Vietnam War, he was masterminded all the bombings there that just, obliterated untold numbers of civilians. Most people will never forgive him for the role that he played in all that sort of stuff. He's an American politician, diplomat. He was the Secretary of State under Richard Nixon, a Jewish refugee who fled Nazi Germany with his family in 1938. He became National Security Advisor in 1969 and U.S. Secretary of State in 1973 for his actions negotiating a ceasefire in Vietnam. This is the ultimate irony of all time, is that he received the Nobel Peace Prize for that, ignoring all the things he was responsible for previous to that. He's now 98 years old, and he was the lead author of 3 authors in this editorial in the Wall Street Journal with the title, "The Challenge of Being Human in the Age of AI, Reason is our primary means of understanding the world. How does that change if machines think? They went through a bunch of different scenarios in the future, one of which they posed the question of, and this is going to happen very soon, is there's going to be an AI that figures out how human emotion works and how screenwriting works and writes the screenplay for a movie that the masses will just absolutely love, and it'll obviously deserve the Oscar. But then who gets the Oscar if it was created by an AI that nobody can even remember who created the AI itself? That's the thing. The AIs just go off on their own. They said in this article, AI then is making decisions about what is important and increasingly what is true. I mean, there you go. You know, we've got these battles right now about misinformation and disinformation and who owns the truth. And it's going to get taken over by AI to decide what is true. The advancement of AI is inevitable, but its ultimate destination is not. There's the issue right now. Is it going to be good AI or bad AI? Here's another guy who basically said that if and when an extraterrestrial shows up on the planet, it's probably not going to be a living, breathing creature. It's going to be an AI of some sort. You know, suddenly a machine will show up and it'll have this intelligence programmed into it. So getting back to James Barrat and some of the things that he said, this is now we're getting close to getting started on our discussion, all the backgrounds laid out. But what really interests me and is relevant to our backgrounds, and again, this is where we're not just a bunch of knuckleheads around a coffee table or something like that, chit-chatting, but we've all got this background in ABT and narrative structure, is to take a look at why I feel pretty certain most of the masses don't see this as that much of a threat. So spoiler alert here, if you really don't want to know how movies end, I'm going to tell you about one movie that you probably haven't seen, how it ends, and I'll warn you when I get to that. But let's take a look at these two movies that deal with artificial intelligence. And this comes out of the 2017 podcast episode that James Barrat did. This really captivated me with all of our stuff on narrative. He talked about this specifically. And what he talked about is that there are a bunch of movies about AI. 2001 A Space Odyssey, if you remember that movie, you know, Dave the computer eventually takes over and it turns into a struggle. Terminator is the story of artificial intelligence in the future, sending Schwarzenegger back to try and take care of a job. And they all have the same basic ending, which is, you know, thankfully in the end, the humans rise up and they regain control of everything and they put AI in its proper place. And we continue as a happy species. The only one that doesn't have that sort of happy ending was the movie Ex Machina that came out in 2014. Terminator came out in 1984, made 78 million back then, but, you know, it's made hundreds of millions since then in the various video. It's part of the culture, basically. You know, it's such a good movie. Why is it such a good movie? Because it conforms with basic classical design of story structure. Ex Machina came out in 2014. Hardly anybody saw it. As a matter of fact, Jen and Jayde and Rod, in that podcast episode with James Barrat that I listened to from a year ago, the host was Australian, and he said it didn't even play in any theaters in Australia. So nobody even got to see that story. So this is classical design that we've been going through in the course. And for a year and a half, I've been presenting it one way. And then finally, just in the last round, I figured out this simple acronym to help people get a better handle on it, because this is so important for making sense of our society today, to have this enlightened view of narrative. So there are 5 key elements of classical design that Robert McKee identified in his book Story. And these are the characteristics that you see of stories that persist over the ages, both in space and time. These 5 key characteristics, first of which I've labeled as flow, which means that people are drawn to movies that have a linear timeline, that are simple, that just tell us events one after another after another. Movies that jump around in time are more intellectually stimulating, but they're hard for the masses to connect with, and they don't tend to work for broad audience. Broad audience wants the story of a problem solution dynamic in which we've got one hero that is out there fighting to try and solve this problem. They want stories that are characterized by the omniscient narrator. This is an age-old tradition in literature. People don't want to read a novel where the narrator doesn't even know what exactly happened in the story. You want to hear the story from that one voice that knows exactly what happened. Not only that, is so omniscient, so all-knowing, that voice can be telling you the story of 5 different things going on in 5 different cities all at the same time. It's just got a complete knowledge and certainty of everything. The 4th characteristic is closure. Everybody wants the happy ending. And that means that every question that gets posed in the story eventually gets answered. And we get to go home feeling comfortable about things that, yeah, the world does make sense after all. And we get a happy end. By the way, as you know, that's the problem right now with the pandemic. We haven't gotten closure on it. We don't have this happy ending of the scientists explaining everything. And then lastly, it's the need for the singular narrative, not a whole bunch of different threads going on at once that are equally important, but the one main struggle that's happening with the one character. Those are the characteristics. I've given it this little acronym, FACS, F-A-C-C-S. With number 4 there, that closed ending is what we're talking about here. And so now we look at the Terminator, and what happens there is that Schwarzenegger shows up. He's the Terminator. He's sent from the AI, and so he represents the AI and eventually the humans that confront him. I mean, here's basically what happens in the story. Back to that. Reese explains to Sarah, an artificial intelligence defense network known as Skynet, created by Cyberdyne Systems, will become self-aware in the near future and trigger a global nuclear war in order to exterminate the human species. And eventually the humans outsmart this thing and they destroy the Terminator. And there again, yet another story to tell ourselves that in the end, we'll get control of this AI stuff. Don't worry. AI is never going to outsmart us. And that, of course, was the story for 2001: A Space Odyssey. Eventually, Dave starts to take over the space station, but the computer takes over and the human ends up defeating it. This is the one story, as Barrett talked about, Ex Machina, that doesn't tell that. So here's the spoiler alert. Sorry, plug your ears if you don't want to hear how this movie ends. I had to watch this movie a second time to really get the point, again, because it doesn't conform with all that classical design stuff. This movie ends with Ava, the AI, this beautiful artificial intelligence being that the guy's created, the guy with the beard on the right, Nathan. Ava escapes the facility, stabs Nathan, escapes the facility, and is picked up by a helicopter meant to take Caleb home, and ends up arriving in an unknown city as she blends into a crowd. That's the final scene of the movie. We see the AI now escaping and getting out into society that nobody even knows that she's artificial intelligence. And so a very unsettling ending. There's your 2 different narrative directions to go. And the great comparison of intelligence, this is what James Barrett talks about. This final thing, we're just about done. It's intro, but it's fascinating. He says, think about it as your dog versus yourself. Your dog has got far inferior intelligence to you. And when you put your dog in the car to take your dog somewhere, the dog has no idea if you're taking it to the vet to be put down or going for a walk. It just can't figure that stuff out. And that's basically going to be our comparison to the super intelligence as it comes along. We're going to be the dog sitting there looking at the driver, the super intelligence, and we have no idea what that super intelligence is thinking. Is it going to take us to the park for a walk, or is it going to put us down? And his last thing he talked about, what can people do? Push for regulation. So there really is an agenda at work here. Break up Facebook, Google, Apple. They have got too much power. They are the cutting edge of innovation on this AI, and they're using it to make money, and they don't have a conscience. We know this. We know this from the whistleblower from Facebook just a few weeks ago saying, sorry, but behind closed doors, they were working their best to get young women addicted to Facebook so they can make the maximum amount of money. We need an international agency to monitor AI. That eventually emerged with nuclear power. There's the Atomic Energy Commission that goes around and makes sure everybody involved with atomic energy, including the Iranians right now, are forced to conform by a certain set of principles. There's none of that right now going on with AI. And as Barat said a year ago, he said, I have zero faith in Google, and they have apparently their own internal AI safety program. Make sure that they don't let things get out of control. And I think the last big question, I would say, what's the bigger priority here? Is it climate, in which we're talking about the year 2050, which is 5 years already after the superintelligence, or is AI a more urgent issue? How do we motivate people about AI when we've got this hitch with the narrative structure? On that note, let's bring on the Unclenchables, our brilliant brain trust here to discuss the future of humanity.
This is my favorite podcast ever because I get to talk about Terminator, which is my favorite film of all time.
So we've got my co-host Jen Martin coming to us from Melbourne. We have got Rod Lamberts in Canberra with Australian National University. We've got Jayde Lovell also in Melbourne with Reagency Communications. And then here in the corner of my room, relegated to the corner, is my buddy, famous surf photographer, Brian Bielmann. who, oops, I don't have one of your pictures hanging on the wall here, but he was the guest back about a month and a half ago for us. And he may chime in with a few peanut gallery comments as we go along, because everybody's opinions are equally valid on this.
I thought that was my job, Randy. You tried to replace me already.
No, he's your colleague. So together. And let's begin with Jayde kicking the legs out from under this entire discussion I presented there and telling us that I am Eeyore and a worrywart. Take it away,
wow.
Jayde.
Well, the first thing I would ask is, are you worried about the singularity, or are you worried about machines and robots taking over human jobs? Because I think these are two very different issues. Will computers take over human jobs? Absolutely, and they are doing so. And that has some narrative issues. So we need to be able to tell that story. Like, this is definitely coming. It's already here. We need to change the way we do politics and consider things like a universal basic income for all these people that want a job but can't get one because a robot has just taken it. And then there's the issue of the singularity. Thanks, Rod. That's coming, as you say, in 2045. That's so far ahead of where we are now that it's impossible to predict. So I'm not so much worried about the singularity. I'm a lot more worried about, there was a great film that came out 5 or 6 years ago called Humans Need Not Apply, and I've linked into it in the notes, about how, look at all of the world's biggest employment sectors. Transportation employs 3.5 million Americans, and soon we'll have self-driving cars. So 3.5 million Americans, what are we going to do with those people that are now unemployable? They have no skills. It's not like we can just retrain them to become nuclear physicists. So that's a real problem, and it's coming very soon.
And we've left out one other huge topic, which is privacy.
Ah, yes. So privacy and cybersecurity. So at the moment, I'm studying cybersecurity at the University of Adelaide, because there's so much happening behind the scenes in cybersecurity policy. And people, many of the public kind of think, oh, that's the nerds. So someone in IT will deal with that. They don't realize that cybersecurity policy has massive impacts on how safe they are in their everyday lives. So privacy, and different countries have different expectations around privacy. So if you live in the EU, people are not allowed to collect your data unless they have an actual plan to use it. Whereas in the US, people are collecting all your data all the time. So just those two, fairly similar countries have completely different outlooks on what privacy means.
Yeah. Jen, you want to take it away and give us your thoughts?
Look, I totally agree with Jayde that I think there's a whole lot of levels here. And I don't know what to make of the big worst case scenario singularity. I found the article that you shared with us from Time magazine from whenever it was, talking about, these 5 very smart people who think that this is going to lead to the apocalypse. I kind of read that and just thought, well, geez, you could have told me earlier then. If it's this bad and this serious, why am I only hearing about it now? Why has this been the stuff of movies for so long if this threat is imminent and real? And so I just don't know what to make of it. I kind of want to put my head in the sand and say, surely it can't be that bad. But then equally, I don't want to seem completely naive, because as Jayde says, it's very real. It's very now, that there's all sorts of things that not that long ago we would have argued, no, you have to be human to do that. There's a nuance here. There's a particular skill here. There's something here that a machine would never be able to do. And I feel like in a very short amount of time, we've had to take very big steps backwards on that and say, well, actually, no, it turns out you don't need human emotion, or you don't need human reasoning, or you don't need human trust or vulnerability or courage or whatever it is to do these things. So I just kind of feel I'm a bit out to sea with it, that maybe it's as bad as they say, but gee, I really, really hope not, because that's kind of shit.
Well, okay. Yeah, no, that's a perfect way to put it, because think about what we do in the course with the ABT build. Where does it start? It begins by going right to the B, the problem, and defining the problem, because we know we can't do anything if you don't know what the problem is. And you're telling us right now that you can't pass that first test of the B, which is, both of you are saying this. I'm not entirely sure what the problem is and which exactly.
So I think the problem that we need to be concerned about is that robots or AI will take over human jobs. The problem that I do not think we need to be worried about is what you're saying, Randy, is that there will be a singularity that will just destroy humans, Terminator style. So I am very worried about the first one, losing jobs, and then having large swaths of the human population being unemployable through no fault of their own. But I'm not worried about the singularity.
Okay, but this is another good ABT build exercise, because once again, what is the problem? You're pointing to the ultimate problem, and we talk a lot in the course about ultimate versus proximate problems. The ultimate problem is that, and you're right, that's so far off and nebulous, it's hard for anybody to process. But there is a proximate version of that, which is what James Barrett was talking about, which is when the atomic bomb was developed in the 1940s. It was developed by a government that had a civic responsibility and obligation and some feeling of that sort. And as he says, imagine if Ford Motor Company had developed the atomic bomb. How would that have gone? But that's what's happening now, is that
Efficiently.
Efficiently, yes. But right now we have Facebook, which on a daily basis we're realizing is a pack of liars, greedy, thieving, liars led by this guy that's himself largely inhuman. He doesn't seem to understand how to relate to humans. Zuckerberg, last Saturday night, they ridiculed him once again. All these shows, he's just a robot himself.
Have you seen the government of Iceland's ad?
What? No.
There's a fantastic ad put out by Iceland that is mocking Zuckerberg, because he's like, look at AI, it can show you all these beautiful things. And then Iceland's like, look, it's called Iceland and it is all these beautiful things and you can really touch them in real life. Look at this. Look,
we don't need no metaverse. Take your metaverse and stuff it down a hole.
Meta, exactly. There you have it in a nutshell. And so it's him, and then it's Google with Ray Kurzweil, one of the smartest guys there now with Google, and all of them over and over again saying, trust us, we got control of all this stuff. And then it's, Tim Cook and Apple. These are not great humanists that are in charge of this stuff. And this is not like, I don't know. I mean, the problem is now nobody trusts government. So it's not clear who should be entrusted with this stuff. But I think that's all the source of the concern. So to get back to what you're saying, no, I don't think anybody can agree on the long-term big picture. It's just, as James Barrett talked about, the question is, will this be a handover or a takeover? Will we hand over our intelligence to the superintelligence, or will it just take it from us and then just start, making
it will take it from us, Randy, because you can't stop progress. And
Yeah.
there's already areas where, you can
wait, hang on. Now, why would you say that, given what we did manage to pull off with the atomic power to date so far? We don't know about the future. But one of the crazy moments in my life was a woman I was involved with once long ago was in a discussion with my mother and was telling her, I don't know if I ever want to have children, because the way things, this is long before the times of all views, in the early 80s, when Ronald Reagan had come in and was cranking up the nuclear threat, and the whole society was starting to get terrified, like, oh my God, we're back to the 40s. And my mother said in 1949, when she had her first child, that was the mindset. This is shifting baselines. People don't know what it was like back then. But after these two atomic bombs had obliterated Japan, and we knew that there were dozens more of these bombs on the planet, and everybody was racing to build more and more, there was a mindset then of, this is the apocalypse now. It's happening. There's nothing can stop this progress. All these bombs are going to be unleashed. And now here we are 75 years later. It never happened so far, knock on wood. So it is possible to contain progress and to, there's that upside potential. We can prevent these things from being a disaster. I think that's what Barrett is saying, is that so long as somebody gets going now and trying to find a way to restrain these corporations that are just going hand over fist. I mean, we know this, these Jeff Bezos, the moneymakers are out of control in our society, and nobody's got any idea how to stop them from just sucking up all the money.
In the next 5 years, self-driving cars are going to take millions of jobs away from humans. I don't think you can stop that, because it's going to be so much cheaper and so much safer when self-driving cars do that. So that's the type of progress I think that you can't stop. Even with nuclear weapons, we couldn't stop their development. It's not like the US isn't sitting on 10,000 nuclear bombs at the moment.
Hang on. I researched this. This is fascinating. We reached a maximum of 75,000 active nuclear warheads. It's now down to 3,500. So humanity did pull it back. That has happened in the past, and that could happen with AI. but it ain't going to happen if there aren't some alarms sounded. And I don't understand why all the panic now is on climate, in which the due dates are 2050, when there's this stuff going on.
But Randy, are you worried about robots taking over humans' jobs?
Not as much as them taking over our privacy and having this enormous amount of power over us, in which we don't know who programmed anything. We can't. This is one of the things in that Henry Kissinger article. They talk about there's a new drug for some disease that has been created by AI, and now they're manufacturing it. No one knows who designed the drug. It's beyond the capability of the human imagination to design this drug. AI went to work and came up with this thing that solved the disease, and nobody knows where it came from. We just know it works, so let's do it. Those things are going to continue to pop up like, wow, this is cool. Where'd it come from? We don't, AI did it. It's so creepy. Rod, why are you so creepily quiet?
I was waiting for you guys to talk it out, because my points kind of move us in maybe parallel or slightly different directions.
Okay. All right. Okay. So before you bring us that perspective, let's hear from the non-graduate degree, not even college educated expert in our midst. Brian Bielmann, how concerned are you about artificial intelligence?
Well, since you're asking a surf photographer from Hawaii, first off, I have to say I'm pretty surprised that I agree so much with all those things you were saying, Randy. Not that we disagree on a lot of things, but I really did agree with a lot of what you said. And it's funny. I come from an area where there's lots of, what's the term when you're thinking crazy theories?
Conspiracies.
Conspiracy theories. I come from the land of conspiracy theories. So personally, I think that what's going to happen with all the jobs going away, like you said, that's going to happen. But they're practicing right now to make these viruses perfect. And pretty soon they can do away with all the worthless to humanity people, such as the elderly or the people that aren't really, giving anything to humanity and are sucking up, like all the free money. They'll just have viruses that can do away with all that stuff. All those people, rather. So I don't think there's anything to worry about. I think it'll end up being a solar world. We'll have all these safe energy things, and there'll be just enough people that can handle, producing all the energy that they need. And it'll be a wonderful world for those 1/4 of the people that get to stay. For everybody else, gone, killed, virused out. I don't know. So that's my take on it all.
That's awesome. All right. So, how brave of me is that to bring in a total conspiracy theorist to give us a completely different picture of the future. Okay, Rod, take it away. Address that theory.
Well, that's not unrelated to some of the things I'd asked. One of the things I only thought about this and heard about this conversation quite recently, which was, I don't know which point to bring up first. So I'll start with this one. So the idea that we humans create these artificial intelligences and we create them in some sense in our own image, at least to begin with. What we don't hear a lot of conversations about is, if we're creating an intelligence, we are creating potentially the potential for suffering in that creature as well, or in that entity. And I don't hear that conversation at all. What are we creating and how miserable can we make it? And I think that gets kind of sniffed at in Ex Machina as well. That AI is suffering. That AI does not know what's going on, is confused, angry, alone, and so forth. And I don't think that gets discussed. We could create horrible things that we torture the living shit out of. And that's something that could lead to malevolence. I don't think it necessarily will lead to malevolence in general. This sort of links to another question I have, which is, the conversations often don't say this overtly. They're so like us, but they're so unlike us, but they're so like us, but they're so unlike us. And so we seem to flip-flop as kind of suits our prevailing emotion at the time. They're going to be so like us, they're going to want to fuck us up. They're going to be so unlike us, they're going to want to fuck us up.
Okay. Let me jump in on that point right there, because I keep trying to pull this stuff back to the ABT conversation, because that's what makes us better than just a bunch
I never heard of it. That's why you're
sandwich shop. So if you think about analytically what you're talking about right there, everything you're saying right there is mucking up the problem. And, instead of having I'm really clear. I know exactly what the problem is. They're going to be selected. You're saying, wait, no, it's this. And so the problem loses focus. And as soon as you lose focus, then you lose leadership and the ability to do anything like that. If you can't even figure out where the problem is, how can you lead anybody to rise up and do anything? So that's really interesting in that regard, is that All this stuff keeps coming back to defining the problem. And if things get to a situation where we can no longer define the problem, then how in the world anybody does anything about it, it remains, kind of strange. Keep going. So that was cool.
Yeah, no, so I think most things are interesting. The transhumanism thing you were talking about, honestly, like all new technology, I never sign up or buy the first version, but man, I'll take version 2.0, no worries. Plug me in, suit me up. I think it's fantastic. I don't understand why we always seem to default to, if it's unknown, it's malevolent. Like I also, there's some great books out by.
Okay, hang on. Look at what I just ran through, those 5 facts about classical design. Number 4 was certainty. And so that's exactly where that goes to.
I'm not arguing with it. I understand
this is theory. Part of the idea of those 5 traits is this is how our brains are programmed for thousands of years. Sure. And we don't get to suddenly make up a new programming for the brain. And so we have this faulty programming that we're drawn to certainty. And that's why certain presidents figured out how to get up there and talk with complete certainty on everything. And certain other presidents have never, tried that.
But we are still forced to act under uncertainty, even if it's poorly acted. Yeah, so it's not like it's completely unknown to us that we have to act this way or we have to act under these conditions. I agree with you, but it's not, that doesn't mean therefore nothing. It means, okay, we have to work out how to operate under that uncertainty and that programming. The transhumanism thing, like I said, look, I'm in, but not for version 1. So the assumption of malicious intent, I think, is an interesting one, because I certainly share that at times, but at other times I don't. So there's a series of books by a now dead Scottish author called Ian M. Banks. And he's created a world called The Culture. And it's a world, a very, very future from now world, where there are large flocks of AIs, and they basically inhabit giant ships. I mean, ships the size of small worlds even. And they're kind of like benign monitors. They're almost like, I don't know, caring and vaguely amused parents of human nature. And as a rule, they pull back from the world. They don't get involved too much. But they're not dismissive, but they're just like, look, we'll get in there if you need us and so forth, but really we'll let them go and play in their playpen and we'll go and play in ours. And they sort of, there's more like a parallel existence. And I don't think that's impossible, because I think it's also very sort of egocentric and self-centered of us to think they'd give that much of a shit about us. It may be also, if they can transmit themselves elsewhere, they'll bugger off. They're not limited to Earth potentially as well.
And so I think that's the thing, is that that AI could, if it finds another life form, it could transmit itself at the speed of light to that other place, and then it will be replicant. Yeah.
Well, and so that gets.
I'll just make one more before I lose it, though.
Sure.
You're talking about the other question I have is, which is slightly to shit stir. How do we know it's not already here? And Zuckerberg is a great example that maybe it is.
That's exactly what I was thinking, Rod. When you were talking about Mark Zuckerberg Randy, I was like, maybe that's who he is. Maybe and we just haven't picked it up yet, and we don't know what to do with him.
He's a bot.
It could be already happening.
We're living in a simulation now, man. Boom.
Woo!
The one thing I really think that we should be talking about immediately is, what do we do when we start to lose jobs to AI?
I like your UBI. I've always liked UBI.
Okay, hold on there for 1 second. Just one anecdote to throw in on a side note about the origins of Zuckerberg. Once upon a time, I was a graduate student at Harvard University. I was lucky enough to be a resident tutor in Winthrop House for 2 years. That's one of the undergraduate houses. And they had, every year was this collection of all the pictures of everybody's, the headshots of every single person in the house, a yearbook type thing. It was called The Facebook. And so I knew the term Facebook way back in the early 80s, long before Facebook came along. And that was the origin of Facebook, which was Zuckerberg lived in Kirkland House, which is right next door, which was the jock house. And he was this socially awkward dude who sat there flipping. And that's what all these guys, these undergraduates, I'd hang out in the rooms, and they'd all sit there with the Facebook. They'd all have copies of Facebook, and they go back, and it was just like, computer dating today. They'd sit there and look at the pictures of the chicks, and they'd, talk on and on about them, and they'd all make notes and things like that. So the Facebook from way back then was this thing really especially good for antisocial people. They could sit there and review everybody's pictures and things like that. So there's your origins. And he never even finished it, at Harvard. He jumped out and did his whole thing. So the guy was antisocial and creepy from day one. And that's the disturbing thing, is that our technology and our society is being led by these people who have no human understanding and impulse. So you were going to say something, Jayde?
Yeah, I think we should definitely be worried about the robots taking over human jobs in the next 12 months to 5 years, and because that's going to create a massive unemployment, and not people who really want a job but can't get one because they are unemployable. It's just like horses. Horses thought, oh yeah, there's no way we're in a safe job. We cart people around. There's no way that we're going to get, made redundant. And then cars came along, and suddenly horses are unemployable. It's not like you can retrain them to do something else. So the amount of horses with jobs decreased to a fraction of what it was. This is going to be the same for humans, in that humans will only need to be employed in very niche roles. But everything from diagnosing diagnosis by a computer is far more accurate than by a doctor. So even things where you're highly educated can be replaced very easily by machines, and a lot more effectively as well.
Yeah, and that's the problem, is that we've had these events in the past where new technology has come along, and it's generally, as a rule, resulted in more employment, but it's never involved this one. And this is what James Barrett was talking about in that podcast. He said the difference with this thing is that AI deals with cognition. None of these other inventions ever dealt with cognition, and that's where it's completely different, and that's where you can't predict where it's heading in that regard.
Yeah, well, you can predict where it's heading. We're all going to be out of a job pretty soon. But the thing is, we will be out of a job like in the next 5 years for many people. So this is only a crisis if we don't do anything about it. So it's fine. But
that's right.
We need to be able to give these people an income so they're not out on the street.
Well, the cool thing is, Jayde, we're very good at mobilizing for impending doom and doing something about it before it hits. So I have no concerns about that at all.
Hashtag climate change.
Oh,
yeah, precisely. Yeah, that was another thing that Barrett talked about, was this general pattern of three things: innovation, disaster, and then stewardship. And that's what he's trying to argue for, is this time let's see if we can get it right and do innovation and stewardship before the disaster. There's
going to be massive suffering because we're not even beginning to talk about this.
That's exactly right. We're not even, and why are we not beginning to talk about it? I point to that thing about the movies that Barrett pointed, the masses have been lulled by these stories that we tell ourselves. And the stories have all been that, don't worry, we will get control of this thing, in due time. Another one of the stories that
I don't think you should be arguing that storytelling's evil, Randy. That's not good for your business.
Well, another one of the little scenarios that my good buddy Mike Backus, he's the one about 3 or 4 years ago began feeding me this literature. Look at this. Are you aware of this? Because he's tapped into that crowd. And one of the science fiction stories that was told at the beginning of one of these books, that was a book of concern about AI, was the science fiction tale of, on the internet already right now, there are all these jobs for coding that are put out there. And, we need somebody to code all this sort of stuff. And here's the pile of money we'll pay you if you can do it. Well, AI eventually is going to figure out how to get on the internet and find those jobs. And instead of taking 3 months to do all the coding the way a human would, it can do it overnight and collect the paychecks. Yeah. And that was this sci-fi story, was that overnight, this AI just goes wild and collects all these paychecks and becomes super wealthy overnight from having claimed every coding job on the planet and solved it all immediately. And there you go. There's the power base. And now it's got all this money trying to figure out what to do with all that. There's a whole, one of the quotes from Barrett was, he said, we are going to see things happen that nobody can explain. Why did that happen? That's the creepy part. Suddenly some industry just gets completely bankrupted. Why did that happen? AI did it.
Yeah.
Taking over from the Russians.
And there's another really important thing here, which is security. So I'm going to shameless plug for SciRise. They're working on.
Fill us in. What's up with that? That's what you're working for?
Yeah, so SciRise helps. It's an accelerator that promotes cybersecurity companies in Australia and Asia Pacific. But because the problem that we haven't discussed here is that, sure, we're going to be developing lots of great tools. And in fact, we all probably have the Internet of Things in our house, either it's on Alexa or a Google or a smart TV. But if a sophisticated enough attacker gets out there, they can use those things against us. And I don't trust Facebook with my data. I don't trust Google with my data. I don't trust the US government with my data, because all of these places have been hacked and the data has been lost. So this has already happened. We need to do a lot more if we're planning to operate on a computer-based society to make sure that that's a secure place.
I trust LinkedIn, where it says that I work for the Azerbaijan Oil Academy.
Yeah, you're doing the right thing.
There you go. And I trust Facebook, where it says I'm a professor at the University of Oneness in Uruguay. So yeah, there's my contribution to the global database. But you're right. I mean, it's going to get creepy. Things are just going to happen. And then the other thing he dove into a little bit in that podcast was Cambridge Analytica. and what went on there. And
Yeah.
Facebook sold them 80 million people's data to Cambridge Analytica and said,
And
don't do anything bad with it.
what
And they took it to
fines or
restaurants.
punishment did they face? Like, what was the outcry from humans going, how dare you
There was a
lose
lot of
millions of records?
tutting. A lot
Yeah.
of tut-tutting.
That's right. Yeah,
I'm
don't
not
do
very
it
happy
again.
with you, gents.
Yep,
Yeah.
the old Black Bart joke. You better watch that shit.
I will write you a very strongly worded letter.
Exactly. I will put together an academic committee that will scold you in a few years. Yikes. All right. Well, we're almost at wrap it up time. Should we be nervous or blissful for the future, Jayde?
I think we should be really nervous about what's coming in the next 5 years, but we should be developing policies. Like, we should see it coming and develop policies to mitigate the harm. But I'm not worried about the singularity.
Okay, and that's pretty far. I mean, how can you be? But that's sort of based on exponential processes that we can't fathom. So,
yeah, and you're absolutely right that we tell ourselves stories that it'll all be fine. It won't be fine. We need to start addressing this now.
And that's that deal with, it all really grabbed me in that moment when he mentioned Ex Machina, and I'd watched it once and didn't even get the story. And then I had to watch the movie a second time around and realize, oh my God, that I didn't get the story because it violates those classical design principles. It did not have the happy ending where it all came together and the humans rose up and won the whole thing. There's nobody to cheer for. It's a grim movie. And that's your problem, is when the actual outcomes don't fit what we have for our programming. Let's see.
So Randy, is that,
yes.
Can I just ask, is that what we need then, Randy? We all think that storytelling is pretty powerful. Is that a real gap out there now, that there aren't more movies that are going to engage, bigger audiences than just us, to get them to think about what this reality might be like? Because you think about, the classical story out there about AI is really different to what we're predicting is coming.
That's the point of this whole episode. Exactly. And I think that, on all these things, I think there's two parts. There's number one, understanding what's going on. Number two, then figuring out what to do. And you can't figure out what to do if you don't even understand it. That's my concern with AI. Like I said, that thing he said about things are going to start happening where everybody's going to be baffled. Why did this company just go bankrupt overnight? Because some AI went at it and, took away all their resources. It's that confusion thing, and it all tracks back to those 5 principles, of which certainty, the omniscient narrator, is really crucial. And that's kind of been our age-old tradition with government, is to be able to trust government. They can explain to us what's going on here. That's the breakdown of the pandemic. Everybody turned to CDC, and CDC said, well, we don't know. And we're still in the midst of that whole mess. So don't know, but I think it all begins with understanding. And if you can't get understanding, then you really got some serious concerns. Let's see. Our next wrap-up statement comes from our designated non-expert. Brian, give us your words for the future. Are you concerned or blissful?
Very, very concerned. You guys have got me even more concerned. I hope some intelligent aliens who have our best intentions come forward to take over. And all I can think of is I just need to go back home to Hawaii tomorrow and go surfing.
Yeah, me too. That's the only thing I could think to solve these problems with. And let's see, we'll save Jen for the last piece of commentary. Rod, you got a final send-off thought for us?
I agree in part with you old hippies. I'm going to move to the hinterland of Australia's Hawaii, which is Byron Bay, and I'm going to reread that utopian manual 1984 and channel the ignorance is bliss part of that. I think that might be the best way forward.
It's the blue.
I'll join you, Rod. I'll be there in Byron.
Final question from Brian.
Yeah, I want to make sure I take the right pill. Which one was the blue one and which one was the red one?
Take the purple pill. It's more dramatic, but you just don't know what's going to happen.
And Jen, our final wrap-up thoughts from Melbourne and your newly liberated society.
Look, I'm moving to Byron with Rod and Jayde and sticking my head in the sand and trying to learn how to surf. I think it seems like the only alternative. But I'd really like to support some excellent filmmakers to make some stories about this so that we all think about it a bit more, because I don't know, I feel like everyone, that the pandemic has put everyone at a point that we're kind of at capacity in terms of things to stress and worry about. And it comes down to what's the most immediate threat. And I don't think any of us think that AI is the most immediate threat. That there was a quote from Elon Musk that as we improve artificial intelligence, that we're summoning the devil. And I don't think any of us know or are thinking about it in that way. So It's
Yeet.
either surfing or it's becoming a bit more mindful about this act of summoning the devil.
The devil has a wonderful wine cellar. That's all I've heard.
All right. So then 2 final wrap-up comments. I hereby proclaim this is the best discussion we've had of the 3 of the 4 of us so far. This was great. Thanks. You guys had plenty to contribute, and I think we hit on lots of interesting points. The second thing is to announce that this podcast is going to be moved to Byron Bay, where we'll all be reconvening there to hold the podcast out in the sticks and where the AI can't find us, hopefully. So on that note, thank you all very, very much. And that wraps it up for this week, and see everybody next week.
Adios.
Adios.
Bye.